I am not a conspiracy theorist. And I think it's dangerous for history teachers to be conspiracy theorists because you shouldn't teach things that aren't fact. So I'm going to give you what history stated about the assassination. Then when we get all the way through this, I'll give you the doer theory of the assassination and why it happened, and then I'll let you make up your own mind. So we're on the subtopic of the assassination of an American president. Does anybody remember approximately what time it is when they took the turn on Elm? Well, 1229 was when Mrs. Conley turned in front of the Dallas County Courthouse and said, Mr. President, you can't say that Dallas doesn't love you. And then they made the turn. Okay, so it's between 1229 and 1230. Well, suddenly, as they're down on Elm Street, at 12:30 p.m., 3 shots rang out in Daley Plaza. So suddenly at 12:30 p.m., 3 shots rang out in Daley Plaza. Now these 3 shots fired would change the course of American history forever. We'll never know what would have been or what would not have been after this assassination. So it will change the course of American history forever. Now I'm giving you kind of a prelude. When Johnson took over the presidency, he put together a commission called the Warren Commission, and they investigated this assassination. So what I'm giving you in history is the Warren Commission report on shots fired. Okay, so this is the order of the 3 shots according to the Warren Commission. Okay, the first shot. This shot was fired from above and to the right of the president's limousine. So if the president's limousine is going this way, above and to the right, up here, and that is where the shot came from, above and to the right. Limousine going this way, above and to the right. Okay? Now the first shot hit President Kennedy in the back, and it traveled downward because it was coming from an upward position and exited out his throat. Okay? So shot number 1 hit the president in the back. He had his arm up, if you look in the video, and so his neck was higher than his throat, and the bullet hit him in the back and exited out his throat. And I'm going to show you the only film called the Zapruder film on the assassination, and you will see the president's hands come straight up to his throat, without question on the film. Okay? So the first bullet hit President Kennedy in the back, and it traveled downward and exited out his throat. And he immediately lifts both hands to his throat. It's just as obvious as could be, and you'll see it in the video. Okay? He immediately lifts both hands to his throat. So that's the first shot. Now the bullet's not done. It continues, and it enters Governor Connolly's back, right behind his right rear armpit. Okay? So the bullet exits Kennedy's throat and hits Governor Connolly in the back at the rear of his right armpit. It exited out of Connolly's body on the right side of his chest, and it shattered his 5th rib. So it goes in his back, through his body, out the right side of his chest, shattering his 5th rib. So the bullet enters President Kennedy's back, traveling downward through the president's body. It exits out Kennedy's throat. Kennedy immediately lifts both hands toward the exit wound in his throat. The bullet then continued. It hit Governor Connolly in the back at the rear of the right armpit. It continued through Connolly's body, exited out the right side of his chest, and it fractured or shattered his 5th rib. As it came out, the way he was sitting, the bullet hit his right wrist, the radius bone in his right wrist. So it hit Connolly in the right wrist, and it shattered the radius bone. And it ricocheted off his wrist and lodged in his left thigh. 1 bullet. Okay? Entered the president's back, traveling downward through the president's body, exiting out his throat. President Kennedy immediately lifts both hands toward the exit wound in his throat. The bullet continued, entering Governor Connolly's back at the rear of the right armpit. It continued through Connolly's body, shattered his 5th rib, exited out the right side of his chest, It then struck Connolly at the right wrist, shattering his radius bone, and buried itself in Connolly's left thigh, where it was later discovered. They found the bullet. We'll talk about that. That was the first shot, from above and to the right. Everybody got a picture of that, as crazy as it sounds? I'll give you an explanation. What? Connolly will live, yes. Okay, the second shot actually missed the presidential limousine and hit the cement curb in front of the triple underpass. And the triple underpass is that underpass where the president was going to exit off and go to the Stevens Freeway. Remember, it had three different roads, Main Street and Elm, and that overpass, they call it underpass, they went under, and there was a guy standing there. We'll show you that. Okay? It missed and hit a piece of cement, which actually came up and cut the face of Dallas car salesman James Tague. And I gave you a handout in your 3-ring binder that shows you James Tague and gives you some information. So you might want to pull that out when you get done writing this. So the second shot missed the presidential limousine altogether. It hit the cement curb in front of the triple underpass, and Dallas car salesman James Tague was standing by the triple underpass directly in front of the motorcade. And he was nicked in the face by a fragment of cement from the bullet that hit the curb and actually bloodied his cheek a bit. Okay? So do you guys have that handout? You might pull that thing out. James Tague. This is James Tague. Let's see, right here. Right up here at the top. Fellow just passed away not too long ago. And he was standing at the triple underpass. And I will show you all this as we go. But that was the second shot. And if you pull out that handout, it'll give you some information. And it also has a copy of his signature. He actually signed that for me, and I just made a copy for you. So that was the second shot. So you might want to take a little bit of time and read through that. Now the third shot is the one everybody notes and remembers, the most grotesque. The third shot hit the president right in the back of the head. And I will show you the Zapruder film. It's fairly gross, but I'll show it to you. But it was a very, very gross shot. It hit the president in the back of the head. Now, do you remember Patrolman Hargis? We talked about one of the patrolmen on motorcycles next to the limousine. He was splattered with brain matter and blood from the president's wound. It was that grotesque of a shot. And I'll show it to you, but it just splattered. His name was Bobby Hargis. And we talked about him before when we talked about the lineup. Bobby Hargis was one of the motorcycle policemen, and his face was covered with the president's brain and blood. Okay, Bobby Hargis. He was on a motorcycle less than 6 feet away from the presidential limousine, and he was splattered with brain matter and blood. Anybody remember who the other motorcyclist was on the other side? James Chaney. Now I'm going to go through this and talk to you about a lot of quotes. And Patrolman Chaney, who was also less than 6 feet from the president, was later quoted as saying on the third shot, he said, quote, his head exploded in blood, just exploded in blood. So he was that close to see that. So both the police officers, motorcycle police officers that were in the motorcade, felt the effects, so to speak, of that. Here's Bobby Hargis right here, by the way. Bobby Hargis. Well, you saw, if you're paying attention on the video, also people that witnessed that fatal shot were Bill and Gail Newman. They were 22 years old and had their 2 boys there. Do you remember on the video when they showed the people in red leaning down on the grassy knoll? That's Bill and Gail Newman. They also saw it. He was interviewed afterwards. And here's a picture right here of that famous picture of them on the grassy knoll, and then signatures here in present day pictures. So Bill and Gail Newman were also eyewitnesses to the third shot. They were both 22 years old with their 2 young boys, and after the shots were fired, they both fell to the grass on the grassy knoll trying to cover their children. Well, this is kind of interesting. After the third shot, Jackie Kennedy begins to climb out the back of the limousine. And you'll get a chance to see this on the Zapruder film. So the first shot comes and he puts his hands up to his throat and he leans towards her and she kind of looks to see what's going on. And when that final headshot hit the president's head and her face was like 6 inches away from it, she just pushed him back in horror and started to climb out the back of the limousine. Now, as this was happening, Clint Hill, who spoke on the video several times, when he heard the first shot, he started to run towards the presidential limousine and he grabbed that handle that was up there and he slipped and almost fell. And if he would have fallen, that Secret Service car would have run right over him, no question. But he stumbled. You'll see him on the Zapruder film, and he's stumbling to get up on the back, and finally he gets on the back step and he pushes Mrs. Kennedy back down into the limousine and then provides a human shield as they race towards Parkland Hospital, which we'll talk about.
Who was that?
That was Clint Hill, the guy that spoke several times on the video. You know why Jackie was climbing to the back of the limousine? Not in fear.
She was grabbing his head.
A piece of the president's skull had been blown off the back of his head, and she was actually going to retrieve the piece of the skull that was laying on the back of the limousine. Honest to God. And Taylor, you probably saw that on that documentary you watched? Yeah. So she climbed immediately back, just in shock, trying to grab this piece of his skull, and Clint Hill, if you can picture him, and you'll see it on video, ran up, almost fell off the limousine, but got up in the back and pushed her back and then provided a human shield as the Kennedy's limousine began to race 77 blocks to Parkland Hospital. Parkland Hospital. Now 77 blocks was 4.6 miles in that geography of Dallas. So Clint Hill climbed up on the back of the limousine. He pushes the the First Lady down, shields both the President and Mrs. Kennedy as the limousine began its race to nearby Parkland Hospital, which was 77 blocks away, about 4.6 miles. Now, I'm going to give you several later quotes. I just want you to listen to these quotes. This is what Mrs. Kennedy was later quoted as saying about what I just told you. She said, quote, "I heard these terrible noises, and my husband never made a sound. He had this sort of quizzical look on his face. I remember thinking he just looked as if he had a slight headache." That was during the first shot when he turned to her. "I remember falling on him and saying, 'Oh my God, they have shot my husband, and I love you, Jack.' I remember I was shouting." Here's what Secret Service agent Clint Hill was later quoted as saying. "I heard a noise. I saw President Kennedy grab at himself and lurch forward. Mrs. Kennedy jumped from the seat. When she noticed that I was trying to climb on the car, she turned toward me and I grabbed her and put her back in the back seat and lay there." Governor Connolly, also hit in the shooting, was later quoted as saying, "Strangely, I had but one thought. This is an assassination attempt. When I was hit, I said, 'Oh, no, no, no.' And then I said, 'My God, they're going to kill us all.'" Kenneth O'Donnell, who was traveling in the Secret Service car immediately behind the presidential limousine, later wrote the following. "After the second shot, David Powers said to me, 'Kenny, I think the president's been shot.' I made a quick sign of the cross. While we both stared at the president, a third shot took the side of his head off. We saw pieces of bone and brain tissue and bits of reddish hair flying through the air. The impact lifted him and shook him limply as if he were a rag doll, and then he dropped out of our sight, sprawled against the back seat of the car." Rufus Youngblood, the Secret Service agent assigned to President Johnson, was later quoted as saying, "I turned instinctively in my seat, and with my left hand I grasped Lyndon Johnson's right shoulder with all the leverage I could exert from a sitting position. I forced him down. 'Get down,' I shouted, 'get down.' The vice president reacted immediately. Still not seeing the source of the explosion, I swung across the back seat and sat on top of him." That was the vice president who was car's back. Okay? Those are some reactions of the people that were there. Well, at 12:33 p.m., the telephone rang in the emergency room of Parkland Hospital. At 12:33 p.m., the telephone rang in the emergency room of Parkland Hospital. The person that answered the phone was registered nurse Doris Nelson. So at 12:33, 3 minutes after the shots were fired, the telephone rang in the emergency room of Parkland Hospital, and the phone was answered by registered nurse Doris Nelson. Well, what do you think I'm going to give you next? What her quote was after receiving such a call. She said, "The operator told me the president had been shot. I thought she was joking and asked her, well, what else is new? But then from the tone of her voice, I knew she wasn't kidding. She said the president's motorcade was on its way to Parkland." So even Doris Nelson was taken by surprise. Okay, that'll take us into our next subtopic, which is events shortly after the assassination. Events shortly after the assassination. So the president's been hit, and the presidential limousine, the motorcade's traveling as fast as they can, 77 blocks, 4.6 miles to Parkland Hospital to see if the president can be treated. So events shortly after the assassination. At 12:34 p.m., United Press International. Does anybody know what that is? Another, you know what the abbreviation for that? You ever heard the Associated Press? What do they call that for short? The AP. Well, the United Press International is another source of news called the UPI. But at 12:34, the United Press International transmitted a 12-word bulletin that went around the world. At 12:34 p.m., 4 minutes after the shots were fired, the United Press International transmitted an 11-word bulletin around the world. And this is what these 12 words stated.
Is it 11 and 12 words?
12, sorry. So make sure you write this down. At 12:34 p.m., the United Press International transmitted a 12-word bulletin around the world that stated the following. Write it down, please. 3 shots were fired. 3 shots were fired at President Kennedy's motorcade. 3 shots were fired at President Kennedy's motorcade today in downtown Dallas. 3 shots were fired at President Kennedy's motorcade today in downtown Dallas. 3 shots were fired at President Kennedy's motorcade today in downtown Dallas. That was the first teletype that came over about the assassination at 12:34, and UPI did it. Now, when this came over UPI, at that same time, over the Pacific Ocean were several members of Kennedy's cabinet, and they were on their way to a trading conference in Tokyo, Japan. So during the assassination, several members of Kennedy's cabinet were on a Boeing 707 airplane en route to Tokyo, Japan, where they were going to attend a trading conference. So his cabinet was doing their due diligence as they normally would on a day, and they were traveling to a trading conference in Tokyo, Japan. Here's who was on that plane. You've heard of them all except for one. Secretary of State Dean Rusk was on the plane. Secretary of State Dean Rusk. Who else might be on the plane to a trading conference in Tokyo, part of his cabinet? Trading conference would involve what? Finances, so who might be there? Secretary of the Treasury, C. Douglas Dillon. Secretary of the Treasury, C. Douglas Dillon. And because there was so much press in Dallas to cover that motorcade, Pierre Salinger, the press secretary, went with these cabinet members to report on the happenings at the trading conference in Tokyo. So Pierre Salinger was there. And another person that was there, and I'm going to finish this day with the story, but I want you to write this down, was Assistant Secretary of State for Public Affairs, Robert Manning. Assistant Secretary of State for Public Affairs, Robert Manning. So we have Secretary of State Dean Rusk, Treasury Secretary C. Douglas Dillon, Press Secretary Pierre Salinger, and Assistant Secretary of State for Public Affairs Robert Manning. Now, when that UPI bulletin went off, they had a teletype in the airplane that those guys were flying in. So they got, some bells went off, whenever a message came through, bells would go off, the bells went off, and this teletype, 3 shots were fired at President Kennedy's motorcade today in downtown Dallas. Well, the man that went over and ripped off that teletype to show it to cabinet members was Robert Manning. He's the one that went to the teletype machine in the airplane when they heard the bells ring and it was typing something because they knew it would be important. And he's the one that went over and tore that off that said 3 shots were fired at President Kennedy's motorcade today in downtown Dallas. He was the guy that tore it off, and he handed it to Secretary of State Rusk. He handed it to Secretary of State Rusk. So what does the cabinet know now? He's been shot at. Doesn't know the details of it, but he's been shot at. So what Press Secretary Salinger did, once he found out, he spoke directly to the Situation Room in the White House. The Situation Room in the White House is where they discussed a lot of what that we've already talked about. Cuban Missile Crisis. So there's people in the Situation Room of the White House, and this is what Pierre Salinger said to the people that were in the Situation Room. You don't have to write this down, but it's important you know it. This is what Salinger said after getting the news to the Situation Room in the White House. He said, "Please listen hard. This plane in which Secretary of State Rusk and other cabinet members are headed for Japan is turning around and returning to Honolulu. Will arrive there in approximately